I'm the most skeptical person I know. I roll my eyes at Ouija boards. I laugh at seances. I have a long list of rational explanations ready for anything that goes bump in the night. Then 3 unrelated things happen to me, 3 ordinary nights, 3 ordinary places, and none of them have a satisfactory explanation. I still don't know what to make of any of it. I'll tell you exactly what I saw, smelled, and felt. I'll tell you the times, what other people saw, and what the evidence, such as it is, actually shows. I won't tell you it was supernatural. I'll tell you it was inexplicable. The first one starts with a weekend at my friend Steve's place. Steve lives out past the last stoplight, on a property that's mostly trees and silence. His house sits a little lower than the road, with a long gravel driveway that crunches under your tires and a basement door that faces away from the main road, out of sight until you walk up to it. He owns a golden retriever, a slobbery, dopey thing that follows him like a shadow and sleeps like a furnace in winter. I was supposed to house-sit for him one weekend. Water plants, let the dog out, make sure the mail didn't pile up. Nothing dramatic. I don't like being alone at night, but it was a Saturday and I thought I'd catch up on a book. Steve left town and handed me a grocery list and a set of keys. "Lock everything," he said. "Don't let the dog out by himself." He laughed when I told him I was a little nervous being out in the country, like it was a joke. He's the kind of friend who packs too much confidence for the both of us. The first night was uneventful. I watched bad TV, made the dog a bowl of food, and dozed off on the couch with the dog's head in my lap. It was quiet. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, the dog's body stiffened on my chest. His ears went up, and then he slid off the couch like someone pulled a string. He wasn't whining. He was barking, low and furious, directed at the basement door. I looked at the clock on the cable box. 3:21 a.m. It's a small detail, and it's oddly specific in my memory. The number stuck because nothing else about that night made any sense. The dog paced, the fur along his back sticking up like a combed ridge. He circled the door and sat down, no longer barking but not calm. He would not go down the stairs. When I opened the basement door, a draught of cold hit my face. Not just cooler air, bone-deep cold, like the kind you get 2 floors below a heated house, except the rest of the house was the right temperature. The light bulb was warm to the touch. The boxes stacked by the wall were normal. But standing there at the threshold felt like stepping into an open freezer. I stayed long enough to turn on the light and check the steps. I listened. The dog sat on the first step and wouldn't come with me. He stared into the dark like he could hear something under the floorboards. I took a flashlight and inched down. Old plywood floors, a workbench with tools, a few stacked boxes of Christmas ornaments. The only thing out of place was a faint smell. Not the damp, earthy basement smell you expect from a house this size. Something sour and metallic that made the back of my throat tighten. I walked from one corner to another. Nothing moved. No footprints on the cement. No open windows. No sign that anyone had been there. I told myself it was an animal. Squirrels, raccoons. Maybe a skunk had crawled in the crawl space and crawled out just before I came down. Maybe the dog, with his nose pressed to the gap under the door, picked up on something old and worrying that my human brain couldn't pass. I closed up, turned on more lights, and walked back up the stairs with the flashlight shaking in my grip. The dog followed at a safe distance and refused to go back to sleep. I slept badly the rest of the night, listening for anything that sounded like footsteps. Every creak made the dog growl. The next night I told myself I wouldn't be ridiculous. The dog is sensitive. Houses settle. I read until the hours ticked over. The dog slept at my feet. At 3:19 I fell into a shallow doze. At 3:21 again the barking started, barking then escalating into that same low, furious pitch. He ran to the basement door and bashed his shoulder against it. The sound made my teeth ache. I went down slower that time. I moved like someone who expects to be embarrassed later. The dog was hyperventilating. His eyes were glassy. I imagine now I was too sure I would find a rational answer. The basement air wrapped around me like a hand. There was the smell again, sharper, closer to the center of the room. It hit me like someone had opened a can of rotten metal. And there, on the floor in front of the workbench, family photos that had been sitting undisturbed on a shelf were sprawled across the concrete. A pair of wooden stools, which I remembered seeing upright next to the toolbox, were turned on their sides. No windows were open. The basement hatch that led outside was latched. There were no impressions in the dust, no footprints in the flour-dry cement. The dog pressed against my shin and whimpered, his whole body trembling in a way that didn't fit with fear of a raccoon. He refused to step across the threshold again. He sat at the top of the stairs and looked down as if the dark itself had weight. Morning came. The smell was gone, like someone had waved a hand and cleared it away. The photos were put back on the shelf, crooked but whole. The stools were still knocked over, but there was no sign of how they had been moved. I texted Steve a panicked message. He called back while I was standing on the porch, still smelling stale air in the cuffs of my jacket. Those smell episodes started when he was a pup, he told me quietly. He would freak out over the basement door. My ex thought it was anxiety. Eventually he got over it. He sounded almost bored, like this was the kind of anecdote people shared at barbecues. "You think it's the dog?" I asked, and I meant it in the way a sober person asks when trying to be reasonable. "I'm not saying there's a ghost," Steve said. "I'm saying the dog has seen things before. He used to drag his leash to the basement and then refuse to go down. My dad blamed the furnace. My ex blamed the neighbors. Nothing ever came of it. He told me to lock up and sleep with the light on. I tried to shake it off that day. I made coffee that tasted like cardboard and told myself not to tell anybody unless I really needed to. I told one friend at work about it over text later, and he sent back a string of laughing emojis and a gif of a howling wolf. I laughed back with him, the kind of laugh that doesn't go all the way. That night I stayed alert until 3 in the morning. At 3:21 my pulse was a drum. The dog slept, finally, after falling into a confused, exhausted slump. I understand now that the most unnerving part wasn't the overturned stools or the smell that had no obvious source. It was how cleanly the events resisted every attempt to explain them. You can dismiss a single anomaly as bad luck. You can write off a smell or a set of knocked-over objects to clumsiness or a mouse. But when it repeats with the same timing, the same place, and the same animal reaction, when the house behaves like a clock striking at a certain hour, it stops being noise and starts being a pattern. Patterns call for explanations. I didn't have one. After that weekend, I didn't sleep well for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined standing at the bottom of that stairwell in the dark, breathing in that coppery, rancid air, the dog shivering beside me and refusing to go forward. I checked under my own bed. I checked the locks on my apartment door in the city more times than I can count. It's funny how a small domestic violation, photos knocked over, can be more disturbing than obvious violence. It's quieter. It lingers. If you like the kind of real-life, creepy stories that make you check over your shoulder, hit like and stay for the next 2. I promise they get weirder. That was just the start. The second story begins in a place that felt safe by design. A gated building with a security desk, surveillance cameras in the hallways, a manager who patrols the property, and a neighborhood where people leave their doors unlocked because it's that kind of place. I lived on the ground floor. The living room window looked out onto a paved courtyard and a thin strip of grass. There were cameras pointed at the main entrance and the corridor outside my door. They advertised it in the lease. 24/7, monitored CCTV in common areas. You expect security to do the heavy lifting and to make strange things unlikely. For the first few weeks, the building was exactly what it promised. Quiet, efficient, and slightly dull. Then small noises began to creep into the edges of my evenings. Footsteps in the hallway at odd hours, soft, running feet, like a child playing a game. Giggling in the stairwell that I assumed was a neighbor's late-night friends. At first I ignored it. The same way you ignore a truck passing by. Background rumble. But background rumble can turn into a detail that won't let go. One night I was reading on the couch when something tapped at the bedroom window. Not a hard knock, more like the soft, impatient drumming of small fingers. I live on the ground floor. My window is 3 feet off the pavement. I paused mid-sentence and the hair on my neck prickled. I told myself it was a kid looking for a cigarette or a delivery person with the wrong door. I didn't open the blinds at first. After a minute, I saw a shadow move across the bottom of the curtain and heard a tiny giggle, like a child trying to be unnoticed. I pulled the blinds a crack, not enough for anyone to see me, and nothing was there except the empty courtyard lit by a sodium street lamp. I texted the manager, half joking. He said he'd check the cameras. The next morning, the manager called me into his office with a manila envelope and a look that was too serious for a building where the biggest complaint is always about the mailroom. He slid a printout of a grainy CCTV frame across his desk. "We pulled this from last night," he said. The image was the kind of surveillance still you see in old crime shows. The timestamp smeared by low resolution, the corridor lit in a flat, anonymous glow. The printout showed 2 small figures standing almost motionless outside my door, inches from the frame. They were wrapped in hooded jackets, faces turned away from the camera, hands tucked into pockets. One of them had their foot angled as if they'd been jostling the doorknob. The camera captured them in place for a long stretch of time, nearly 10 minutes, frozen like a delay in a cheap video player. "You see how close they are?" the manager asked. "They were here for a long time. We called security, but by the time anyone could get down here, they were gone." I stared at the grainy black and white image until the edges softened. 10 minutes is a long time to stand within arm's reach of someone's door and do nothing else. The idea that they could have slipped down a staircase or melted into the shadows felt groggy and impossible. The CCTV showed no obvious path of exit. Most of the corridors that could have led away would have been visible for at least a second or two. The footage simply shows them, and then the next frame shows only an empty hallway. No skid marks, no sudden sprint off-screen, nothing. "Did anyone see them on any other camera?" I asked. "We ran the other feeds," he said. "Nothing. It's like they weren't anywhere else. Like they were just outside your door and then not." I asked for a timestamp. He told me it had been late, well after midnight, but he didn't have the exact time at his fingertips. Later, when I spoke with the security officer who had reviewed the tape, he told me they'd replayed the stretch, frame by frame, and there was indeed no clear exit. "1 second they're there," he said, his voice carrying the tiredness of someone who has accounted for dozens of petty crimes and oddities. The next, gone. He was careful not to use words like vanished. He was a man trained to use terms like not present in adjacent camera zones or no continuous path observed. But if you strip away the training, what he described was the same thing the printout showed. 2 small hooded figures standing at my door for nearly 10 minutes, and then nothing. Manager's face softened when he told me there had been something of a tragedy in that apartment years before. "The previous tenant had children," he said, almost apologetic. "Bad situation. It's complicated." He wouldn't give me details. I didn't push. I didn't want to learn anything that might lead me to a tidy explanation, only to watch it fall apart. After he showed me the printout, I began to notice other things. The sound of tiny footsteps grew more frequent. Once, late at night, I heard the knob on my door rattle, just a soft, mechanical jostle, and the hair on my arms went prickly. I put my ear to the door and could hear what sounded like a whisper of voices, too soft to decipher, shaped like children's speech. On another occasion I looked out through the peephole and saw 2 small silhouettes pressing at the glass, their heads level with the knob, the hooded backs of them showing like blank little moons. I pressed my body against the door and told myself to breathe. I called the manager and he came up with a flashlight and a copy of the printout. We checked the stairs together, peered into the camera blind spots, walked the corridors and the service areas. There were no signs of forced entry, no scuffs on the paint, no sliding footprints on the pavement. The point-of-entry theories fell apart under routine scrutiny. The CCTV simply presented them as having been there, and then not. Which brings you to the part that unsettles me most. Security footage is supposed to remove ambiguity. It's a mechanical memory recorded unblinking, a file saved and reviewed by competent people who write incident reports and file them under numbers. If anything, a camera should make events less weird. But sometimes the camera preserves the weirder part and strips away the rest. The camera shows the figures standing outside my door, and the camera shows them gone. The camera does not explain how they left. It does not account for the whispering or the tapping on the window. It does not tell you why one of them, on the printout, has their shoulder nudging the knob for a long while, as if seeking something. It left a handful of questions with clean edges. When I asked whether any of the neighbors remembered seeing children or heard of missing kids, there was a tight, embarrassed silence. An older woman who lived 2 doors down crossed herself and said, "They were here, once." She wouldn't elaborate. The manager's face was a study in professional regret. "There was an incident," he said, then stopped. "I can't share specifics." That reluctance to speak felt like another gap in the record. At some point, that night or a week later, someone in the building joked, half laughing, half nervous, that the building had children in its bones. You don't laugh when someone says that in a place where there's a camera showing something that shouldn't be there. The laughing is a thin membrane stretched over curiosity and fear. The footage was a cold, grainy piece of evidence that refused to become a full explanation. It showed 2 hooded figures near my door for nearly 10 minutes. It showed them vanishing from camera view without a path of exit. It was the sort of thing that would make a skeptic like me squint, replay, and then try to find a human solution. Maybe it was prank kids. Maybe someone had dressed as children and hopped on and off a ledge that the camera didn't see. Maybe the timestamps were wrong. Each theory felt plausible for 5 minutes, and then collapsed the moment you compared it to the rest of what people heard and felt in that hallway. The giggling, the knob jostling, the whispering that sounded like 2 tiny voices saying something almost intelligible. I left the manager's office with the printout folded in my pocket like a talisman. I told myself I would be rational, that I would install a cheap motion camera of my own for the hallway right outside my door, that I would not jump to spooky conclusions. I also slept with the bedroom lamp on that night. I didn't know then that the CCTV still I'd been handed was only the beginning. The printout sat on my kitchen counter when I got home. Sometimes I would stand and stare at the grainy figures and try to imagine practical routes they could have taken. 10 minutes is long enough for a determined adult to make a mischief of a dozen different ways out, but the grain kept me from seeing edges. The concrete absence of an exit nagged at me the way a splinter under your skin will. I went to bed with the lamp on and the blinds closed. The hum of the refrigerator sounded louder than usual. I told myself that I would record anything else that happened. I even wrote in my phone, like a person leaving a note for themselves. "If you ever move again, do it sooner than later." It read like a joke at first, then like something in a diary that knows a little too much. The security report remained open for a while. The manager followed up once in a professionally uncertain way, and security said they would increase patrols. I felt a small surge of relief, the kind you get when an adult confers authority over a worrying thing. But authority has limits, especially when the evidence itself resists explanation. The building's cameras had recorded something without accounting for it. My rational mind started to fray at the corners, tugged by small, persistent sensory ghosts, the giggling that felt too near for comfort, The repeated knob rattles, the hollow feeling you get when a threshold is no longer just a practical line, but an ambiguous border you are not sure crosses to where. I kept replaying that image of two small hooded figures for days. If you think the first story was weird, wait until you hear what happens next. The image of those two little hooded figures, frozen in a grainy still and then not there, kept replaying in my head like a loop you can't scrub past. I told myself again and again, there must be an explanation. Kids playing a prank, a glitch in the timestamp, an unnoticed maintenance access, anything that would let me go back to treating the building like a predictable, manageable place. But then the noises got closer. One night, sometime after the manager gave me the printout, I woke to the clatter of something soft against my bedroom door. It was a small, methodical rattle, the sound a child's hand makes when it tests a doorknob, the way they test whether a new toy will work. I glanced at my phone, 1:30 a.m. The clock read like a dare. I counted the numbers twice to be sure. For the first few seconds I lay there and pretended not to hear it, as if pretending would make the sound stop. Then I heard it again, and beneath it a high, muffled whisper that made the hair on the back of my neck lift. "Mom, we're home," someone breathed. Quiet, but in a voice so childlike my body reacted before my brain did. I sat up and pressed my back into the headboard, too aware of the flimsy defenses of a bedroom door and the fact that I was an adult in a building that advertised 24/7 security. The whisper came again, closer to the air vent or the gap beneath the door. There was a cadence to it, as if a pair of small voices were trading lines. The knob rattled in the way the CCTV still had suggested, tiny, almost playful. I pressed my ear to the wood and thought of every rational possibility. A neighbor down the hall with friends, someone messing with the door as a dare, a recording. Nothing fit cleanly. I padded to the peephole and ducked low to get a sliver of view. For a beat there was nothing, just the dim corridor light and the familiar flicker of a sensor in a fixture. But then two little shadows pressed up against the lens, heads bowed, as if they were checking to see whether anyone answered. They were small enough to look like children, hip height to the knob, and their hoods made their faces impossible to read. All I could see were the blanket-like backs of them, and the way their shoulders hunched, the way one leaned forward and nudged at the knob with patient, repetitive movements. I felt my rational scaffolding shift under that image. I thought of the CCTV still, of the manager's reluctant mention of the previous tenant and those vague, heavy words. Bad situation. He hadn't said more, and I didn't press him because sometimes a person's silence is a courtesy or respect. Other times it's a warning. I called the manager and then the security desk. An officer came to my door with an official kind of calm that aims to soothe. He peered through the peephole and nodded at me like we were in on the same joke. They'd sweep the halls, he said, increase patrols, check blind spots. I asked if they could release the complete footage, multiple angles, time stamps, anything that might show a path away from my door. He seemed constrained by protocol. "We'll review what we have," he said. "There are no visible entries or exits on the adjacent cameras during that window. They swept the building that night. They knocked on apartments, woke people up, checked stairwells and service doors. Nothing. The two silhouettes were not linked to any other frames. No one reported seeing a pair of children running away." The manager made a point of telling me there had been noise complaints before, kids in the evenings, but nothing that matched the hush and the timing of what I'd experienced. The security officer gave me the kind of look you give a neighbor when you don't want to say, "I don't know what to tell you," but all of the words that mean the same thing are heavy and expensive and require time. There were other small, impossible things that followed. Once I left for work and came back to find the tiny scuffs on the paint near the stairwell that could have been a kid's sneaker dragging, but were too clean, too low. like something that had been there for a long time and then smudged into being. Another night I woke to the sound of light feet bounding past my door and into the stairwell. The building's security log showed no alarm triggers, no coded entries, nothing. Once I checked the peephole and saw two rounded heads and a pause that felt staged, as if someone were testing the line between curiosity and intrusion. I began to flinch every time there was a faint sound in the hallway, the metal scrape of a recycling bin or the creak of an old door. My apartment stopped feeling like mine, in the way your hand stops feeling like your own if it's been in cold water too long. I asked the manager outright about the previous tenant. He hemmed and then said it was difficult, kids involved, a messy situation. That was it. No dates, no names, no police reports handed over to me, just the kind of closed answer people give when there's nothing helpful to say, or when the things that happened are better left framed in grief than in explanation. The building kept its cameras, it kept its patrols. The printout in my pocket continued to function as a disquieting object I would take out and look at, like a way to remind myself I had evidence, even if that evidence didn't help. I tried to be sensible. I installed a cheap motion camera just outside my door, aimed at the threshold. I put up an inexpensive floodlight that would illuminate anything near my entrance. I peppered the security desk with questions, left polite notes, tried to convert fear into paperwork. Even with those precautions, the weirdness didn't stop. One evening, as I was leaving for work, I saw fresh marks on the mail slot at someone else's door. Tiny, precise smears of mud that suggested small sneakers. And a neighbor whispered as I passed, "You ever hear things?" She'd seen them, she said, and the look in her eyes suggested something she'd half believed and half wanted to forget. I thought about how perception shifts when you know something exists. Once you believe, every ambiguous sound becomes evidence and every shadow a suspect. Eventually, the anxiety overtook the usefulness of staying. It wasn't a single terrifying incident that forced me out of that apartment. It was a compound interest of small invasions. The silent tap of fingers on the window, the muffled giggling under the stairwell, the long minutes recorded on a camera that show only their presence and nothing of their coming or going. The meshing of the audible and the visual that made them more than a prank, but less than explainable. I began to dream in corridors. I began to check under my bed in a way that felt ridiculous for an adult until you're the one hearing the knocking. I moved out a month later. I didn't tell everyone why. Needed a change, I said. Easier to let the narrative lie where it could. The footage stayed as it was, a stubborn, grainy record that raised more questions than answers. Even now, when I pass a child in a hoodie in a grocery store, my heart lurches in a way that embarrasses me. I do not have a storybook ending for that printout. I have a relocation and a list of what I checked and what I asked, and the way a building designed to make you feel safe can do the opposite by failing to account for the small, uncanny things that slip through the cracks. If the second story was about a threshold blurred by shadow and camera blind spots, the third story felt more like surveillance turned personal. Tiny, bright, tacky things that at first feel like compliments and then become evidence of a presence inside your life you did not invite. It started the way most stalking stories do now, in small, almost flattering notes. I work a job that places you in a small bubble of anonymity. Same shift, same coffee, same walk to the company parking lot. One morning, I dragged my coat on, unlocked my car, and found a sticky note adhered to the handle, neon pink, obnoxious as a highlighter. "Hi," it said in a looping, friendly script. I laughed, folded it up and put it in the glove compartment, like a souvenir from someone's bad flirt attempt. A second note appeared a week later. This time it was wedged under the windshield wiper. "You looked really cute yesterday," it read. My first instinct was to be flattered. It's a small thing to be noticed. But then the notes multiplied. They began to move from benign to unsettling. "I know where you live," one read in sharper letters. The ink smudged like a thumb had paused over the words. Another, folded and tucked under the driver's side mirror, said, "You look cute when you're sleeping." That last one landed like a cold hand. I remember the exact moment I read it, because the parking lot was empty and the air stung with that indifferent November chill. The words were explicit, and they were wrong in an important way. No one should know when you sleep unless they should be in your bed. It felt less like attention and more like trespass. I told myself to call the police. I told myself to tighten up, but I also told myself not to magnify the threat by reacting in panic. So I wrote a note and left it on the handle that night before I went to work. "Stop. Do not contact me. I've reported this." Maybe it was childish. Maybe it was tactical. I wanted to see what happened. The next morning, I found a new note inside my refrigerator. It was one of those small, square, fluorescent things pressed on the fridge door with the cheerful force of someone who expected to be heard. "You really don't like playing?" it said in block letters. Someone had slid it between grocery magnets and the afternoon sun. My chest tightened. I checked the locks again. Deadbolts, chain, the stick-pin latch that only I had keys for. Nothing had been forced. No window was open. The front door latch showed no marks. The rational explanations, mistaken identity, shared keys, a forwarded note meant for a friend, collapsed under the simple fact that the note had appeared inside, not outside. I called the police and they came twice. They were professional and kind in the way that people who work in repetitive trauma become, sympathetic but constrained. They dusted the note for prints without ceremony and told me the type of things you hear on television. Fingerprints aren't always left on paper. Paper can be handled with gloves. Handwriting is notoriously unreliable as evidence unless you have exemplars to compare. They did what they could with what they had. They suggested neighbors, an ex with a grudge, a misdirected obsession. They advised I change locks and avoid certain patterns. I did all of that. New locks, a small camera pointed at the entryway, an alarm sticker on the window that felt performative, more than protective. I started varying when I left for work, keeping the car in a different spot, parking where the lot was observed by motion lights. None of it stopped the notes. Sometimes they were just on the car handle in the morning, childish hearts or ridiculous smiley faces. Other times they were worded with a cruelty that suggested boredom had hardened into menace. I found one on my front step that read, "I know where you live," and another left tucked into the spokes of my umbrella. "You look cute when you're sleeping." A night came when I woke to shuffling in the living room, a soft, intermittent scraping like someone moving a chair across the floor. I grabbed the old baseball bat I kept in the closet as a joke against the city's more practical dangers and crept to the bedroom door. The floorboard creaked under my weight in a way that felt unkindly loud. I locked the bedroom door from the inside and curled on the bed, bat across my knees, and listened to the noises get closer to the other side of the apartment, and then recede. At dawn, I found a neon note folded and placed conspicuously on the kitchen table. "I guess you don't want to play anymore," it said, the letters deliberately spaced like a casual sign-off. That final note changed something in me. It was not in the tone of the notes before. It was a line that assumed my fear and mocked my caution. It revealed an understanding that whoever left these knew my patterns well enough to anticipate my reaction and then comment on it. There was no claim of ownership or explanation, just a closing line that I could not read as anything but a triumph. Months went by. Servers of suggested safety measures, police notebooks with scantrons of scribbled observations, a friend sleeping over, the neighbor with CCTV who offered to save footage for me when she could. Nothing led to a name. No camera in the parking lot got the face that could be matched to a suspect. The police told me that without corroborating evidence, video or eyewitness testimony that could stand up in court, cases like this are frustrating to pursue. That was the other pattern I noticed. Institutions are built to handle the clear, the visible, the criminal as defined by statute. They are poor at dealing with the persistent minor invasions that erode your sense of privacy without quite breaking a law in an obvious way. I quit that job not long after and moved across town. I sold my car and bought a less conspicuous model. I changed my locks again. I married someone patient and practical who, bless him, calls knife-hardened boundaries reasonable precautions and will install a better camera at the drop of a hat. Still, there are moments, late in a quiet house, folding laundry, hearing wind against the gutters, when the memory of tiny neon squares and their clipped, threatening messages rises up and makes my fingers flutter. I wake sometimes to check that the bedroom door is still locked and imagine that a sticky note could appear on the inside of the house, like a physical residue of the anxiety those months produced. The 3 stories, Steve's basement, the hooded figures outside my apartment door, and the neon pink notes, are different in their shape and their vector. One involved a dog's reaction and a smell that vanished with the daylight. One involved grainy footage of 2 little silhouettes that seemed to insist on being there and then not. One involved a gradually escalating invasion of privacy through the peculiar intimacy of sticky notes. Different mechanics, different settings, different textures of fear. But the connective tissue is simple. In each case, an ordinary domestic boundary was crossed in a way that technology, authority, and common sense could not satisfactorily pass. Cameras recorded what they could, but failed to explain the how. Security and the manager and the police did their procedural work and still left the central facts intact and unresolved. And throughout each incident, I hovered in the same place, a skeptic wanting a tidy, rational account, repeatedly denied one by the stubbornness of sensory detail and pattern. I mention the exact times and the particular words because that specificity is what keeps me honest about my disbelief. If you tell people you smelled something rotten at 3:21 a.m., they might nod and call it a faulty furnace. If you show them a CCTV frame, they might squint and call it a glitch. If you receive a neon note on your fridge that says you look cute when you're sleeping, they might tell you to file a report and change your locks. But the thing that shakes you is the accumulation, the smell that appears and then is gone, the 2 figures that stand where there should be no reason to stand for nearly 10 minutes, the notes that move from flirtation to menace. Each, on its own, could be explained away. Together they carve a pattern into what you'd thought of as safe. I still try to stay anchored in rational explanations. My default is skepticism because it's kept me sane in situations where stories and rumors run wild. I don't claim ghosts, demons, or a tidy psychological diagnosis. I claim unresolved encounters with things that trespassed across ordinary boundaries. The word I use over and over is not supernatural, but inexplicable. No satisfactory explanation was found that fits each of the facts without stretching beyond what evidence supports. If you've ever felt your home shrink around you because of something you can't name, you know how efficient fear can be. It fills the spaces you use to move through without thinking. It makes you rearrange routines and buy extra locks and change jobs and pack boxes you hope will create distance more useful than any camera. I don't want to leave you with the sensation that I believe in boogeymen behind every door. I don't. But I will say this. There are things that happen to me that remain on the page of my life as lines that someone at a later date might smooth over or explain away, and no explanation fits all the facts. The basement smelled of something metallic at 3:21 a.m. twice, and a dog who had been unflappable for years reacted like he'd been shown something. The building's CCTV captured two hooded, child-sized figures outside my door for nearly 10 minutes and then recorded no path away. Neon pink sticky notes appeared on my car, escalated in tone to threats, and one ended up inside my home on the refrigerator, despite locks and precautions. I don't have answers. I have the memory, the seconds on the clock, the printout folded in a drawer somewhere, the image of a dog refusing to step down a flight of stairs, the whisper in the hallway, and the way a bright square of paper can make a house feel like an unsafe place. So I'll leave it to you. Tell me what you think. Maybe someone can explain this better than I can. Maybe you've had something similar happen and the only comfort you found was to be heard. Comment with your theories or your stories. If anything I've said resonates, share it with someone who likes these kinds of true, unsettling tales. If you want more, subscribe. There are other things I've seen and half explained that I still can't arrange into a narrative that satisfies me. I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe in being honest about what I couldn't explain. And that, for now, is enough to leave me a little off balance when I pass a dark basement door, a camera's grainy eye, or a neon note stuck to a windshield.